reserve your applause until I'm finished. Let me just begin by thanking profusely Douglas for inviting me to give this lecture, as well as my fellow faculty historians in the department. I also want to thank a few people without whom I shall be exceedingly remiss and fundamentally lacking in both courtesy and gratitude. And they are, if they are in the audience, please nod. And they are Matt Woodman, Brett Schmall, and Mary Pulowski, who have gone through this text with a fine-tooth comb and asked me to excise several things which justly were undeserving of the text that I'm about to give it to you. I also want to thank at least Jeff Provence, who scanned meticulously a series of documents for the presentation that was going to accompany this particular talk. And I'm afraid you are now bereft of the visuals. For those of you who are visual leptic, you are just in for a very tough, textually driven ride. And then, of course, finally, and most important of all, I want to really thank the department as a whole for providing me a home in which both space as well as intellectual nourishment could conceivably be provided so that I could begin and possibly end this particular monograph on Viriamu, the historical role that it played in the end of the Portuguese Empire. I've timed this particular talk for about 55 minutes precisely, but evidently I shall be slightly elastic as a result of what we have gone through. I can't ask you to do the clicking, so there you are. As historians, we are trained to examine sources either submerged in a well of archives or nesting as memories. When we argue with the past, we hover over texts from what we consider a virtually value-free position, and from this vantage point, we construct edifices for slivers of data we deem important. Rarely do we consider the archaeology of the data in the context of their epistemological hierarchy. Rarely do we knowingly examine in writing our relationship with the edifice we erect, particularly if we do so with evocative data. We seldom partake in what I call engaged transparency, which is to say, to preface our work with our subjective experience of the text and how the latter shaped or continues to shape us. In other words, how do historians work? Works without an engaged transparency, I maintain, are just that, texts without context. They leave readers making assumptions regarding our intellectual honesty, wondering what stirred our souls to write our texts. Readers are left to infer our rationale from the positions we have taken on significant points in our narrative. Without such an intellectually honest preface, historical works can play hide-and-go-seek with you and perpetuate in the process their intrinsic power over value. Ultimately, historical truths are context relative. Historical truths bereft of context are teleologies masquerading as knowledge-bearing truths. Such works invite the perception of their worth on either good faith or the presumed integrity of their authors. Further, it is a fallacy to believe that such historical works are ipso facto objective. They are not. They engender hierarchies in the discipline and condone power rather than passion, resulting in divisions between historians, their texts, and their readers. The relationship between historians and their text is complex, as is the impact that these have in generating discourses, and by discourses I mean texts advancing knowledge and dialogue, both steeped in cultures of evidence. Of course, power and authorial provenance continues to govern the discipline, but so does a firmly held belief in epistemic pluralism. Ultimately, though, it is discourses that engage you in arguing with dominant views of the past that advance the frontiers of knowledge in the discipline. Engaged transparency helps to germinate such cultures. The historical is personal, in other words. Failing to recognize this perspective as important for oxygenating discourses is tantamount to killing diversity with toxins. Texts without engaged transparencies have the power of co-opting themselves into dominant positions, subsequently displacing works by their opponents as inconvenient, uncomfortable, or irrelevant to a particular view of building knowledge. Furthermore, the inclusion of the personal in history discourages opacity, as does the inclusion of history from below. Inclusion here allows competing voices to build knowledge around openly shared epistemologies, ones that remain open to dialectics, oral research, and methodological diversity. In the end, we as historians and history as a profession surely will perish should we fail to frame our historical texts with some form of engaged transparency as part of a larger effort in the discipline to challenge dominant texts, electing not to see, let alone acknowledge, data from below. Readily access to internet-based data, wikis, blogs, photos, and video-intensive weblogs and discussion boards have profoundly fragmented the discipline's unique sense of what is legitimate historiography, bringing in their wake a profusion of approaches to fuel professional history-making. This profusion implies that if history is to survive as a cohesive discipline, we should seriously consider integrating this idea of transparency of the personal or engaged transparency as required norm. If centrally organized as a taxonomy of historiographies, such norms would immeasurably help the fight against historiographic arteriosis by advancing the discipline as an all-inclusive enterprise. Else, dominant narratives will continue cleaving histories from below into bits of anarchic epistemes. Initially, I tried to write this text by holding the personal at bay, to no avail. Such a detachment eviscerated its logics of history by ignoring the value of knowing fueled by hurt. That is why this text begins with the personal. My encounters with Diabo in Portugal's Mozambique, the impact it had on me, and the way the story shaped both the text's epistemic probes, the search for answers, first in printed repositories and then oral sources, and the training I undertook to address said probes. Portugal discovered Mozambique quite by accident. Both its landing on and departure from Mozambique were marked by exceptional acts of self-deception. One such act occurred on Thursday, 25th of January, 1498, 6 months after a group of Portuguese sailors and translators beached near the coast of Quelimane, 56 miles north of the mouth of the mighty Zambezi. That coastline was sprinkled with Arab traders and many sultanates. Vasco da Gama led the beached travelers dressed as a Muslim from Morocco to elicit a friendly local reception. The other act of deception occurred 474 years later, 3 years before Portugal's terminal departure from Mozambique in 1975. Relying on deceptive information, Portugal's conscript army encircled Viriamo, located 267 miles as the crow flies from where da Gama had originally landed. They were convinced of finding insurgents embedded among civilians. They found none, which resulted in Viriamo's total wipeout. I heard of the Viriamo massacre on Tuesday, 10 July 1973 at 9:30 in the morning, just after I had come out of a grueling meeting over school fees with the principal of the tutorial college I was attending in southeast London. The principal was concerned that my funds would prove insufficient for the year ahead. I assured him I had the money and I would make up the rest from wages earned as a rockery gardener to a Czech literary and music critic living in exile. The last thing I wanted was to go back to Mozambique, where a full-blown colonial war had raged since 1964. A return would have meant conscription into the army to fight in a war I did not believe in. In the end, the principal agreed to reduce the fees and let me stay for an additional year. I was relieved, elated. No, more than elated. Endorphins rushed through me to diffuse the fears of forced repatriation. A classmate handed me that morning's London Times, just as I stepped out of the principal's office into the bright summer sunlight. The paper had Portuguese massacre reported by priests on its front page. I sat perched on the parapet overlooking the car park and read the rest of the story that revealed gruesome details of a massacre. Essentially, this is what the story claimed. On 16 December 1972 at noon, the Portuguese colonial armies surrounded Viriamo and decimated it. The entire complex fell silent. The smoldering fields of fire were said to have reeked of carrion for days. The scavenged cadavers apparently continued to burn, covering the area in a dissipating pall of smoke. Nearly 400 people died on that Saturday as one man bellowed the final directives. A funny Wednesday, kill them all, followed by leave no one behind. Some of the soldiers returned weeks later to burn and bury the mourning dead, wearing bandanas as masks, soaked in Old Spice aftershave to counter the stench of rotting flesh. Such revelations overwhelmed the sentient among us with grief. Viriamo was located in Mozambique's central northwest district of Tete, in a triangle 355 miles away north to the west of the village I was born, Buzi. Both villages were similar in size and demographics, near the banks of a river, one on the edge of the mighty Zambezi and the other near River Buzi. Both were near a colonial district capitals, Beira and Tete respectively. Like Viriamo, Buzi had no electricity, running water or sewer, and unlike Viriamo, Buzi had no tarred roads nearby nor public transportation buses. Like Viriamo, Buzi hugged a riverbank abundant in toads, crocodiles, mambas, hippopotamuses, and iguanas. I also knew from contacts in the region that the colonial army and war was heading southbound towards Mozambique's narrowest girth, diagonally across from my village. The thought of a similar tragedy striking at or near the place of my birth threatened my sense of belonging. Memories of Buzi welled up, and memories were all I had far away from home. Viriamo reawakened the trauma of having lived under Portuguese colonial rule. Perhaps the most hurtful of all memories was race bias. I remembered predators lying in wait to haze non-whites in line to buy a cheese bun in the school cafeteria. For that cheese bun, we were willing to put up with slurs and separation and eat near the secluded gulch abuzz with mosquitoes. At 13, such an indignity twisted my insides into balls of cauterized trauma. All I could fear was fear. All I could think of then was escape from that infernal colony. The Viriamo massacre, therefore, did not surprise me. When I read the story in the papers that morning, to those of us who had lived in the belly of the beast, we had come to expect such virulent use of force. Mozambique was not alone in this. Angola had witnessed a similar episode of mass violence, as had Guinea-Bissau. Further, Portugal was in stellar company among its imperial peers and Africa's ruling white settlers. The French Empire, for instance, massacred rebels and civilians in Algeria during their saboteur of peace. The South Africans periodically engaged in this practice, as did Spain, as did Britain, Belgium, and Germany. The most noteworthy case, of course, perhaps was von Trotter's near annihilation of the Herero during Otto von Bismarck's chancellorship. Here, von Trotter's army nearly matched Hideyoshi's in cruelty. However, none of these suppressive acts of terror had catalyzed an accelerated end to colonial rule as the Viriamo massacre had about to do. Viriamo's demise, therefore, was an act of perdition, sufficiently sinew to deserve a well-framed text that needed to be told. I felt that such a text had to be multi-grained and level-headed to do justice to the gravities of the event. It had to use common sense. It had to have a passionate etiology. It had to be densely imbued with introspection and courageous enough to recognize, accept, and deal with absences of fact and limits of endeavor. It had to be recognizably robust in nourishing truths, or epistemes, to quote Michel Foucault. I considered several such epistemes as overarching contexts in which to nest the events at Viriamo was one. I also considered others, including what the place was like viewed from the canyon's rim, as it were, or lived by a subaltern world down below. The challenge was to find the most sensitive and context-appropriate framework for my study. I followed the reports in the media, but there was something that actually would trouble me. Viriamo, as revealed, didn't appear quite complete, and I could not put my finger on why I saw this in this way, until a few months later, when reflecting on works by Geoffrey Butterclough and Edward H. Carr. Butterclough's argument that history, if properly treated, can be seen to presage future social realities was important. This perspective helped me to view the Viriamo massacre as a two-sided coin, one historical, the other predictably consequential for the Portuguese Empire. One side therefore nested its past, its epistemic genesis. The other side prophetically helped Portugal's imperial demise once its act of military deceit was outed. For, ironically, that is what Portugal's commander in Tete called the operation that devastated Viriamo, Operação Marosca, Operation Entrapment. E.H. Carr's assertion, on the other hand, that history was not an exercise in empirical omniscience, solely driven by digits and data, but an interpretative discipline anchored in evidentiary culture, helped narrow the analysis of Viriamo massacre. Historians argued Carr assigned prominence to selected facts that they deemed important to contextualize a given text and reveal new insights, insights that could be superseded by new findings and new perspectives. What I heard, in effect, was a whisper inspired by Carr. Dhada, call into question the grand narrative as you examine what it fails to tell us and why. Carr was right. Counterinsurgency framed Viriamo during its public outing and after. Portugal's conscripted army, military, and the secret police occupied center stage. Insurgents appeared to be in the shadows as fleeting references, as did the dead, who appeared as iconic victims, their lives before the massacre left untold. Viriamo, as publicly revealed, had silenced the voices of the data gatherers and their transmitters, the lives of the victims before their erasure, and the voices of the survivors and priests. Given an opportunity, I felt, they would have had as much to contribute to the discourse on the events that led to and caused the massacre. In other words, Viriamo was a puzzle, and a somewhat under-narrated, one that could be understood better once the voices of its edges were brought center stage to shed their own light. Until then, Viriamo would continue to provide writers grist for their fictional mill, attract deniers and skeptics, or haunt the sentient among us with questions on Viriamo's erasure and its narrative resurrection. As the years progressed, additional questions surfaced. How and why was the story contested, and where do the texts on Viriamo stand today? I immediately set to work on addressing these questions. Several factors, however, impeded the research. Portugal itself was undergoing a sea change as it sought to divest its colonies after Marcelo Caetano's ouster. Portugal's new leaders, now liberators, were unlikely to prove receptive to anyone requesting access to respondents and sources with information on the massacre. In addition, perhaps the most important factor that was my own lack of personal maturity and professional formation between 1972 and 77. During this period, I was involved in cataloging as an intern of ephemera on Luso-African liberation movements and church-related materials in 3 repositories. 2 of them were London-based, and the 3rd repository was Father Adrian Hastings' Viriamo papers and private diaries, which I helped organize as he moved from London to Birmingham, to Cambridge, to Oxford, and then to Leeds. As an intern, the years shaped my early thinking in historical research. I was sensitized to view propaganda materials, news clippings, posters, banners, photographs, cartoons, images, and films as legitimate sources for studying atrocities elsewhere in Luso Africa within the context of its nationalist history. Exposure to discourses, however, at these particular internships had an unintended consequence. While there, I had witnessed the staff advocating the need for a forceful and dominant anti-colonial narrative, one that effectively demonized the Portuguese and elevated Frelimo, the liberators, on a pedestal as revolutionary vanguard. I could clearly see the need for such a binary that placed Portugal on the defensive. As a propaganda tool, such binary texts proved morally vital to secure Portugal's colonial defeat. The problem was that this binary assumed a life of its own after colonial independence as a teleology, infecting Portugal's historical, political, and scholarly discourses. This infection, in turn, made the culture of evidence for an historian inordinately difficult to validate epistemically beyond ideology. What began as a utilitarian instrument to further liberty, transmogrified after Mozambique's liberty into a dominant force against pluralism in a society and interpretative scholarship. I could not help but wonder if there was room for a more nuanced approach to nationalist history for the reader. I carried with me this sense of methodological unease to Sussex, which helped me resolve it through professional training and exposure to new historical methods in a variety of settings. That university had just instituted a school exclusively for training scholars in history in African and Asian studies. In a year-long extensive tutorial, AFRA has trained me to handle images, that is to say multimedia materials, as sources for historical analysis. The tutorials had been carefully crafted by the late Bruce Graham, an Australian-born political scientist and historian, and F.G. Bailey, the well-known social anthropologist, under the rubric of ideologies and change. The AFRA's common room was a buzz with young love and with historians and area specialists discussing colonialism, uses and abuses of imperial archives and artifacts, and the role of subalterns and their place in colonial and post-colonial histories. Ranajit Guha was our resident historian in subaltern studies. As his recent book attests, he still remains, at age 91, an active practitioner and a critical thinker in the field. I followed his seminars and their spillover discussions, engaging vigorously several historians to consider the problem of ephemera, ideology, and change in framing historical texts on decolonization. One thing became clear to me. The last stage of anti-imperialist struggle, in its Leninist sense, was not against neo-colonialism, although that struggle was imperative to operationalize constitutional independence. Rather, it was a fight against epistemological imperialism, in which the subaltern was deliberately situated center stage to fuel post-colonial history, one that assiduously eschewed the epistemic erasure of the former oppressors, while placing discourses on culture and identity of the new post-colonial self at the center of policy and praxis. Then, and only then, could the narrative of liberation and freedom transparently free the neo-colonized from vestigial imperialism. To prove this, I first tested Graham's methodology on a sample of ephemeral materials by manually constructing a database that arranged data elements in diachronic and synchronic columns, with each data element bearing a uniquely designated source code and alphanumeric identifier. The results suggested this methodology to be exceptionally well suited for extracting direct and inferentially derived data elements from salvageable ephemera. With this test under the belt, I focused on assessing whether extant works in primary sources and literature were robust enough to address epistemic inclusions of both sides of the divide and tackle the queries framed for this particular study. Frelimo materials, the nationalist materials, envisioned a new Mozambique and its strategies to defeat Portuguese colonialism as a struggle on three fronts: military, state building, and diplomatic. The Viriamo massacre, therefore, fit two of these three fronts: the military, which led to Viriamo's erasure, and the diplomatic, which led to its resurrection as a critique of Portugal's conduct of war internationally. Data and details on both the nationalist military operations and its diplomatic initiatives proved woefully cryptic. Data on foot soldiers within the movement, their supporters, and the affected peasantry was Spartan. Where generalities abounded, teleology terminally infected the data. The resulting texts were steeped in what I would call ersatz history twisted to serve a normative purpose. In addition, Frelimo repositories were resoundingly silent on three aspects of the narrative: the massacre itself, the society, culture, and politics surrounding Viriamo, and how Viriamo responded to Frelimo's and the nationalist overtures to attract popular support for the war in Tete, responses that may or may not have resulted in Viriamo's erasure. Unraveling this mystery, I felt, was important for two reasons. One, to determine the role of the party, if any, in attracting Viriamo's terminal entrapment. And the other was to clarify how nationalists managed to advance so rapidly in Tete without apparently undertaking a sustained mobilization campaign. Frelimo materials reviewed here had failed to suggest a similar robust undertaking of civic culture to pull Tetes towards an imagined post-colonial history. Could it be that some other entity might have done the work for the nationalists? The CIIR collection and Father Hastings' privately held papers confirm this to be the case. The nationalists in the church appeared here to have shared the same epistemology. Self-determination, with the former stressing, in theory at least, the rediscovery of a new self as a precondition for liberation, while the church engaged in cultivating a sentient Christian but post-colonial identity. In Mozambique's Tete, oral texts suggested that missionary priests were engaged in exactly the kind of transformational work that Frelimo would have had to undertake on its own, with the same degree of intensity that its counterparts in Portuguese Guinea had undertaken to initiate their armed self-determination, with the former stressing, in theory at least, the rediscovery of a new self as a precondition for liberation, while the church engaged in cultivating a sentient Christian but post-colonial identity. In Mozambique's Tete, oral texts suggested that missionary priests were engaged in exactly the kind of transformational work that Frelimo would have had to undertake on its own, with the same degree of intensity that its counterparts in Portuguese Guinea had undertaken to initiate their armed insurgency. That is why the nationalist texts in Mozambique had nothing of cultural or contextual value directly related to Viriamo case before its disappearance. But the church documents and their ephemera did. However, even here, among materials related to the church and owned by the church, the voice of the local community, the parishioners and the survivors, were murmurous. They were inked by priests in missionary society bulletins. Consequently, these voices left one in the dark on how survivors and informants volunteered themselves into written history, so to speak, how the text of Viriamo was compiled, revised, and transmitted, and how the priests protected their sources to safeguard the integrity of the story as reviewed. As imperial holdings, could the Portuguese archives speak for the dead at Viriamo or their executioners? Not really. They appear as resoundingly silent at Frelimo, in large part because of Portugal's obduracy to investigate the event. Further, entrapment was representative of several hundred such military incursions against the people of Mozambique, except that in this case it proved fatal for Portugal's 474 years of imperial rule on that colony. By late 1978 or early 1979, I had finished digging into additional repositories in print. It soon became clear to my initial assessment proved correct, in that archival work alone would be insufficient to address the queries framed for the study. To address these, I would need to collect evidence from respondents after undergoing training in a number of fields: oral history, topometry for mapping elevations, rudimentary osteology for handling bone remnants, and mental health appropriate for handling respondents suffering from post-traumatic syndrome or PTSD. Only then could I address the massacre in the context of Tete's lethal cat-and-mouse game with the Portuguese, between the nationalists and the Portuguese. With this realization, I set to acquiring the skills necessary for the work ahead. I was helped considerably here by the works of the Oral History Society and its founder, Paul Thompson, the renowned social historian. OHS had a strong presence in Oxford. Exposure to their work helped me develop tools in oral history methods that I subsequently tested in a pilot project which, and I'm afraid Cleone is not here, she would have appreciated this, which resulted in a study of a subaltern history entitled Murmurs Under the Stairwell: What Butlers, Stewards, and Servants Do in an Oxford College. I'm glad I got a chuckle out of you. It's nice to see you. By late 1980, I felt reasonably confident of the skills that I had acquired for the study. My first port of call was going to be Lisbon to consult the national holdings at CEDAC and the National Archives at Torre do Tombo, which later proved to have nothing of practical value on Viriamo. My final destination was to go home, Mozambique, to undertake field work in the Viriamo Triangle. Just then, the entire project came to a crashing halt. I was rendered stateless. By the time the Master Alan Bullock, the historian and author of Hitler, The Study of Tyranny, and fellows of St. Catherine's College obtained travel papers for the Portuguese authorities, it proved too late. The 15-year war, this time civil and not colonial, was in full swing in Mozambique, blocking safe and secure passage to Tete for the fieldwork in war-ravaged Viriamo. I shelved Viriamo as a doctoral project and chose an alternative thesis, The Nationalist Politics War and Statehood, Guinea-Bissau, 1953-1973, which was subsequently published as Warriors at Work. In the meantime, several works on Viriamo appeared in print. None, though, fully addressed the key questions centrally framing this text. That is why I resuscitated the project in 1994. I secured a Fulbright stipend for a year, 2 years after Renamo and Frelimo peacefully negotiated an end to the civil war and marched on two fronts: archival work and oral interviews. My archival work entailed tapping documents in Mozambique, printed materials in the Burgos Fathers in Spain, repositories in Portugal, Britain, the United States, Canada, Holland, Germany, and Italy. I structured my oral interviews thematically. On-site fieldwork, including preparation, lasted for 8 months, starting in December of 1994. I interviewed respondents in Spain, Portugal, England, and the United States between 1995 and 1997. The last interview took place in New York as recently as March of 2013. My oral interviews sought to question fundamentally the grand narrative. This objective proved easy to fulfill in a sense, since all I had to do was to address the lacuna in current literature and question the unfolding text, focusing on contradictions and dissonances where these emerged, and where these could be addressed on site itself. I was indeed well aware of the need to be extremely sensitive in how I framed my questions so as not to invite defensiveness in my respondents. On the other hand, I always used words like, help me understand this, or help me with this fact here. Initially, I found it difficult, though not impossible, to strip bias from oral evidence, particularly ones pregnant with evocative data. One approach I took was to always question the grand narrative and its alternatives posited to me in my head by imaginary respondents. I kept reminding myself there was an infinite number of inferences I could draw on for every fact presented. At first glance, you could infer an expression of affectionate care from hearing the story of a young herder carrying a goat home in his arms. Subsequent probes seeking clarification on its context, followed by a physical demonstration of how they carried the goats in their arms, under what circumstances they engaged in such practices, and how old was the herder, revealed the goat to be pregnant. Safe delivery of the goat was essentially a protection of capital. The loss of a kid would have meant the loss of a potential 45 escudos once the kid grew ready to be sold in the local market, not counting the loss of future kids if the goat died. On occasions, respondents wanted me to view the event through a certain prism. In one case, during a group interview, I was told that children had been pounded to death in mortars and pestles. And by the way, massively, we don't have that PowerPoint because there are some gory pictures. Yet I knew that men, let alone armed men, did not, in principle, handle mortar and pestle because of gender bias. If the Portuguese colonial forces did engage in beating children to a pulp in mortars, then they must have had ample time and energy to devote themselves to this task, thereby delaying their mission objective, which was to clean out Viriago as quickly as possible of its living humans as if it did not exist. The soldiers and then interrogators, it transpired later, were keen to get the operation wrapped up before sunset as they could tent up for the night in a relatively safe zone. This is not to suggest that rape, pillage, and the taking of women as trophies could not have occurred. They may have, but I failed to unearth primary oral sources proving the atrocities enumerated here to have occurred as told. When I asked respondents if they saw any of the atrocities mentioned above, they responded in the negative. I could draw only one conclusion from this, that in the heat of the storytelling, someone may well have just a pestle to stand for the butt of a gun. The latter gruesome, the gesture was very likely to have happened since the Portuguese, short of arms and ammunition, were under instruction to spare bullets. We used grenades instead. They killed more people than a bullet, said the commander of the operation to me when interviewed later for this work. I chose respondents to help me with data recovery on the massacre after a short pre-selection process using cross-indexed references to gauge the strength, content, depth, consistency, and context of data as they had to offer. I took great precautions to focus first on eyewitnesses. I placed on hold respondents eager to tell me their stories based on hearsay, or respondents with stories told to them by deceased primary sources until the first phase of recovering primary sources from this primary data ended. I expressly eschewed topics of rape and genderized violence to minimize emotional footprint on female respondents unaccompanied by a female field worker. In all instances, I took great care to avoid triggering PTSD episodes. In the face of such episodes, and there were not many, my two field workers and I, one male and one female and I, stopped gathering data. We used empathy and motionless silence to allow grief an uninterrupted space to mourn the events until the narrative flow dissipated towards a safe and secure hearth. To relieve stress, my respondents and I took frequent breaks and changed our seating arrangements. We tried to keep sessions on data collection distinctly separate from other forms of social interactions among respondents who had not seen each other for a while. The male field worker trained in PTSD triage stood by me always, to monitor boundary maintenance during the interviews. He checked me daily for signs of premature vicarious trauma, for continuous exposure to massacre testimonies. He also generally helped with the fact-checking, logistics, provisions, lodgings, water and fuel supplies, and structured time management. Clinicians experienced in PTSD-related fieldwork had advised me to take mandatory sabbaticals. I took two. One to travel to Maputo to share preliminary findings with scholars at the Center of African Studies, Eduardo Mondlane University, and the other I spent sculpting near Ponta do Ouro, a beach resort. We welcomed respondents to choose their place of interview. The majority of survivors chose the foot of a boab tree on the massacre site at Virigamo because they felt the need to bond with the survivors still rooted to the site, albeit a tree. Those are interviewed at adjoining massacre sites either chose a spot near a chapel or a water well. Survivors are interviewed in Tremusis selected a larger boab tree to lean against, quote, because it saw and could hear what we are saying, unquote. We designed all interviews to be minimally invasive. We began with recording basic biographical data and chose muted colors for microcassettes and the clothes we were wearing, and kept interview equipment and their carriers to a minimum, leaving the interview process visually free of the learned tools of the trade, pen and paper, etc. Where we needed these, we bought them locally. We felt that introducing imported materials could hinder the process of data collection. This way, respondents were free to focus on their testimonies in a place of their choosing, free of icons of imported modernity. We varied the formats of several interviews to fit in with the needs and the pace of respondents. Some preferred constant prodding. Others invited didactic probes, and here we sought to help of companions to cross-check facts on memory recall. We used group discussions and palavers frequently for collecting data on lineage, demography, poultry, goats, and cattle. We found it was easier to gather data on vital commodities and resources, perhaps because these related to life in a village before its end. Such data ran the gamut, from points of reference pegged to specific boulders and land and watermarks to animal wildlife. Two respondents withheld what they knew from us, but perhaps because they feared that by telling their side of the story, they would be unable to safely return to a normal life after revisiting the trauma of their ordeal. In two cases, the interviews took unprecedented turns. One constructed on site how he escaped from the inferno enveloping him and his family. I have a photograph of that reenaction, and unfortunately I can't show it. The other relived with eerie precision the process used to collect the list of the dead on the very night of the massacre. Both felt they had accomplished something by choosing to relive the day. In doing so, they uprooted as a tsunami would the interview protocols carefully put in place to facilitate data gathering. One respondent who went blind for an undisclosed and unexplained reason following the massacre physically retracted his trajectory to escape the carnage that followed him close at heels as he sought to warn the others. One respondent's narration on a little reported massacre site at João was equally cinematographic. My interviews outside the triangle followed a similar protocol, except in a handful of cases. One entailed a Burgos priest from the Basque region, the son of a bullfighter, who played a role in protecting a key eyewitness to help an English reporter bring proof of the massacre back to London. He was jubilado in Madrid, retired. I had to interview him while he performed his three chores as a rooftop gardener, as a pigeon breeder, and as an assistant to a priest in the local medical recovery program. I was at his disposal during my stay at his sanatorium. The resultant interviews appeared unaffected by the din of cooing pigeons and traffic noise. He spoke as he walked to the streets of Madrid, usually during lunchtime as he headed to the parish church. We were attached to microphones linked to an analog micro tape recorder, which I held in my hands to ensure we remained appropriately tethered. Several interviews had to be held in hotel lobbies, army barracks, luggage storerooms, a sanatorium, private dining rooms, hotel rooms, a bar, a coffee house, a yacht club, a seminary, a church, and over restaurant meals. I found interviewing in these places absolutely challenging. They were held without the aid of my PTSD triage field worker, an oral history technician, whose job was to help me adhere to my planned set of questions and ensure I maintained boundaries. With the result that I had repeatedly had to review details of data recovered and ensure that they were recorded in their proper sequence. Oddly enough, 2 interviews carried out under these conditions yielded a set of multi-layered and richly textured texts. Of the 2, the most noteworthy was with the interview with Beetle Pringle, the Sunday Times of London journalist, which lasted for 12 straight hours with copious consumption of grappa, during which he confirmed the veracity of the massacre backed by photographic evidence. He penned the preface to my forthcoming book. One interview with Father Hastings proved exceptionally effortless. He was erudite, well-structured, highly detailed in his approach to provide the appropriate content, and brought to the process notes and diaries to ensure accuracy and depth in the telling of the story. Perpetrators and their families were the most challenging to interview. At times I really found it difficult to maintain a balance between judgment and value-neutral transparency. The trick was to convey an understanding of what they had done, but stop short of engaging in associative sympathy with who they were. Killers who had engaged in the slaughter of unarmed civilians, men, women, and children. In one instance, an informant threatened to end the interview because I was seen lacking in empathy for the agony he felt of what he had done at Viriam. In another, an interview having agreed to talk ended the session abruptly. My value-neutral attentiveness proved, according to him, disconcerting to tell me the whereabouts of the killer who fired the first shot at Shawara. The forthcoming book does indeed bear scars of that interview failure as a hole in the story, which it clearly annotates in its chapter on how the massacre occurred. My most difficult interview was expectedly with the commanding officer of the massacre, who, after much coaxing and cajoling by an intermediary, agreed to a meeting following certain precautions. It was a veritable chapter from a John le Carré novel. He reserved the right to decline to meet me should his visual scan suggest him to walk away from the rendezvous. He asked me to go to a predestined spot and sit on a bench, its back wedged between hooks pinned to an oak tree. The tree overlooked a roundabout in a nearby pork farm located in a secluded area somewhere deep, deep south of Lisbon. He put in place one other condition, which was to allow him to reply to my questions with nods of the head, a precondition that nearly scuttled the interview, as responses had to be manually recorded against a lengthy scroll of questions which I had prepared in advance. Mercifully, after the first visual scan, he agreed to meet for an interview. He began with nods to say yes, and head shakes to signify no. As we progressed with the interview, the head nods and shakes turned into grunts, and then into clearly articulated responses. By late afternoon, the head nods disappeared once he eased into the interview process. I jettisoned the set of questions that I had planned to ask, ushering in a process of a free flow of information that lasted for a couple of all-night sessions, followed with supplemental daytime interviews conducted after his workday was over. His last words were truly cathartic. "You know, I have not discussed these things as deeply as I have now," he said. He walked away, leaving behind a dark burden released from captivity in his within. The project went dark in 1997, after my Fulbright return, for several complex reasons. I had been very careful not to mix the personal with the historical during the interviews. I cannot say the same about my state after processing the information I had uncovered. In other words, the historical had come to devour my personal. I was indeed traumatized by the collection of evidence. I was, in effect, suffering from secondary trauma stress, what the clinical psychologists call. I lost my ability as a historian to practice my craft, which I had partly recovered after a decade and a half. Clearly, I had failed to adhere to debriefing protocols prescribed for fieldworks dealing with collective mass violence. Self-denial did not help. Neither did my resounding failure to address the matter with the urgency that STS deserved by enlisting the help of professionals in the field. In the meantime, I made 2 attempts to bring the project into print. One text I penned examining how and why Portugal denied the massacre as it was being revealed. Another article, which appeared bereft of footnotes in compliance with the journal's publishing guidelines, exposed Portugal's culpability in the affair. I made the final push to consolidate the research in 2010, 2 years before an article questioning aspects of the Viriamo narrative appeared as a case study in civil wars, which a historian familiar with the case in Switzerland had brought to my attention on 31st of May 2012. I took this note as a wake-up call, if not a call to arms, to race the project to the finish. Partly to this end, I already had resigned as the Dean of Graduate and Undergraduate Studies at California State University of Bakersfield, retreated to faculty among fellow historians, where I felt most comforted, and set to work on two scholarly texts. One offered a critique on the article that appeared in the Civil Wars Journal, and the other outlined skeletally the Viriamo massacre. The final response to that last wake-up call will be here soon. A monograph on Viriamo's terminal entrapment that tackles its context, its erasure, its resurrection as a publicly outed narrative, and its afterlife on real, imagined, and contested parades. I'm hoping to follow this text with a companion volume on oral testimonies on Viriamo in the very near future. In the meantime, I think it is 55 minutes precisely. Thank you. I have one final paragraph. Sorry, you are very clearly determined to leave. In the meantime, it would appear, by the way, this is the best part of the talk. At least I think it's the best. You might disagree. In the meantime, it would appear official Portugal is unrepentant, except for Antonino Melo, the commander who led the massacre. Nailed to the cross by his conscience, he remains exactly where he is, haunted by images of half-burnt bodies left behind. Truly, with massacres like these in its imperial history, can Portugal afford to lose its national conscience? I hope this text will help Portugal's civil society find it and help its nation atone for Viriamo's total wipeout.